6. Something was jabbing Martha in the back, but she was so focused on the advancing army of cats that at first she didn't register its significance. Then it struck her. She was leaning against a doorknob. She twisted round in the confined space between the doctor and the wall and realised there was a door literally carved into the wood panelling. The reason she hadn't noticed it before, aside from the fact she'd been preoccupied with not getting her face scratched off by a mob of possessed felines, was because the door was so flush with its frame that it was easy to overlook. Even the doorknob wasn't much bigger than a walnut. She curled her hand around it and gave it a tug, and the door popped open. "In here," she hissed. It seemed that the reason the cats hadn't flown at them already was because the doctor was doing something clever with his sonic screwdriver. He was sweeping it in front of him, creating some sort of barrier or field or something which the cats seemed reluctant to cross. They kept trying, but then would jump back, yowling as if they had had a mild electric shock. If the door hadn't been here, she supposed this tactic would have resulted in a tense stalemate, lasting until either the cats returned to normal, the doctor got cramp, or the sonic ran out of juice, if it ever did. The doctor glanced over his shoulder and saw the open door. "Brilliant," he grinned. "Oh, I love doors, me. #1 invention of all time, and so versatile. Did you know the outlawing of doors was directly responsible for the fall of the Timerian Empire? All that extra faff climbing in and out of windows and having to walk up and down stairs because you couldn't use lifts anymore meant that nothing ever got done. Productivity dropped, the economy crashed, and all because her royal tech trope got her 4th proboscis jammed in a suction door and was made to look a prat. Bonkers. Utterly bonkers." By the time he had finished babbling, the 3 of them were through the door and had hurried down a worn flight of stone steps. They found themselves in a low-ceilinged but sizable cellar, cold and dank and smelling faintly of apples. The only light came from a fur-coated bulb hanging from 6 inches of flex in the centre of the ceiling. A long slit of a window, hinged at the top and set at eye level in the opposite wall, provided the only visible escape route. The green, foggy darkness pressing against the glass gave Martha the odd sensation that they were underwater. The doctor looked around. "Norman Bates chic," he said musingly. "Like it." Above them, they could hear the cats mewing and padding about. The doctor pointed at a large wooden trapdoor set in the stone-flagged floor. "What's that?" Etta frowned, obviously irritated by what she saw as an irrelevant question. "It's a fruit store," she said. "Nothing but a big, airtight box in the earth. There's no way out through there if that's what you're thinking." Martha noticed the doctor purse his lips, noticed too the way his dark, unblinking eyes lingered on the trapdoor for a moment. Then he hurried across to the long, narrow window on the far side of the room. "Shame about the cats," he said as he unlatched the window and cautiously lifted it. "I was getting quite fond of them again after all the friendly ones we met on New Earth. But this lot have blotted the copybook. They've sent cats plummeting right back down my species popularity chart. Not that it's their fault, I suppose." Martha glanced at Etta to see how she was taking all this, considering that the old lady was obviously a cat lover. Etta didn't look angry, however, merely worried. Martha could guess what question Etta wanted, but was afraid, to ask, so she asked it herself. "Will they stay like that?" The doctor was peering through the long letterbox slit of the window, presumably on the lookout for more hellcats. Wisps of green mist drifted in through the gap like probing ghostly fingers. "Nah," he said dismissively. "Soon as whoever's put the hex on them realises we've legged it, I expect they'll switch off the old voodoo. Your moggies will be harmless little furballs again by the morning, I should think, Etta. Probably be a bit offish, but blimey, they're cats. Who's going to notice the difference?" He lifted the window all the way open and pushed it back. "Right, I think the coast's clear. Come on." He levered himself out with no apparent effort, then grabbed Martha's hand and hauled her out just as easily. Not for the first time, she was surprised and impressed by his wiry strength. Together, the 2 of them pulled Etta out of the window. She was not a slim lady, and it was a narrow gap, but after a bit of oofing on everyone's part, they managed it. Standing in Etta's backyard, mist curling around them, the doctor suddenly looked a bit awkward. Sorry for causing you all this bother, he said to Etta. She looked sternly at him for a moment, and then her face broke into a smile. You know what? I haven't had this much excitement in years. The doctor looked delighted. Oh, bless. So what now? Martha asked. He puffed out his cheeks. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm parched. Back to the hotel for a nice cuppa, I think. Geez, will you get off my case? Shouted Chris. He jumped up from the breakfast table, pushing his cereal bowl away, causing milk to slop onto his placemat. Hey, don't talk to your mum like that, growled Tony Pirelli. But she's treating me like a kid, Chris protested. Well, that's probably because you're acting like one, his dad said. The boy's mother, Amanda, looked upset. I only wanted you to have a proper breakfast, she said. You know I don't like you skipping meals, Chris. But I've told you, Chris said. I'm not hungry. And why is that? His dad asked pointedly. Chris spread his hands. I'm just not. Why does there have to be a reason? Suddenly, Tony Pirelli looked very serious. It's not drugs, is it, Chris? Chris rolled his eyes. Oh, give me a break. Then he became aware that both his parents were looking at him, their faces grim and anxious. He looked back at them, aghast. Man, I don't believe this. No, it's not drugs. Drugs are for losers. But you are a loser, muttered Rick, who was obediently eating his Cheerios and had been silent up to now. Takes one to know one, runt features, Chris said. I am not having that kind of talk at the meal table, snapped Tony. He started it, Chris protested. Why don't you tell him? I'm telling both of you, said their dad. Sorry, Dad, said Rick demurely. Chris pulled a disgusted face. I'm out of here. Not before cleaning up this mess you're not, his dad said, indicating the spilled milk on the table. Chris tutted, grabbed a wad of kitchen paper and used it to mop up the milk, then dumped the wet paper in the trash. Now can I go? That depends where you're going to, his dad said. Nowhere, said Chris. Then, seeing the thunderous expression forming on his dad's face, he sullenly conceded, Brad's. And will you and Brad be coming along to help us set up the Halloween carnival? Tony asked pointedly. Chris shrugged. Dunno. It would be nice if you did, Chris, his mom said. I'm sure your dad and the rest of the Halloween committee would be grateful for all the help they can get. Yeah, whatever, Chris said, and slouched towards the door. Then he sighed and turned back. Maybe we'll come along later, he muttered. Don't bust a gut, his dad said. As he tromped down the street, Chris felt bad. He hadn't liked running out on his parents, but he was still scared after what had happened in the night, and being scared had made him too angry to talk. He just needed to be on his own for a while, to think about what he'd seen and what, if anything, he was going to do about it. He turned out of his street and was heading off down the road towards town when a voice behind him shouted, Hiya! Chris turned. Jogging towards him through the mist was a skinny man wearing a tight suit and a long brown coat, an inane grin on his face. Oh, great, Chris thought. This is all I need. Scowling, he said, Have I got a sign above my head or something? The man stopped and scrutinized him so intently that Chris felt as if his thoughts were being read. Then the guy glanced above Chris's head. No, he said. Should you have? Chris sighed. Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested. What is this? Hassel Chris Day or something? There you go, said the man. Knew I was right. About what? About you being him. Who? Under his breath, the man said, Blimey, it's true what they say about teenagers. Slowly, he enunciated, You, Chris Pirelli? Yes? Chris scowled. So what if I am? With a pleasant smile, the man said, Tell you what, Chrissy boy, let's just skip all the teenage angsty stuff. We'll take it as read that you've got issues, that no one understands you, and you're confused about your sexuality." "I'm not," Chris began, but the man shushed him. "Because otherwise, this planet will be in flames by the time we finally finish this conversation. And if anyone tries to blame me for not saving it like I usually do, I'll just point the finger and say, it was his fault, Mr. Awkward Pants here." Chris stared at the smiling man and noticed again how dark and weird his eyes were. Maybe he was just a loon, though Chris couldn't help thinking there was more to him than that. He couldn't help thinking, in fact, that the guy was not just smart, but that somehow he saw everything. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm the doctor," the man said. "The doctor?" repeated Chris heavily. "Oh, yes," said the man, as if he expected Chris to be impressed. "Okay, so what's that supposed to mean? Is it like some online geek boy name or something?" The man blinked, swallowed. For a moment he looked uncertain how to respond. Then he said, "Anyway, moving swiftly on. Where's the book, Chris?" "What book?" Suddenly the guy looked deadly serious. "I really haven't got time for this." But I don't know what you're talking about," Chris said weakly. The man stared at him a moment longer, and then the easy smile was back. "No, you don't, do you? So what's bothering you then?" Again, Chris got the impression that the man could see into his head. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Okay," said the man with a dismissive shrug and turned away. "See you later." Chris stayed silent for maybe 3 seconds, watching the man, the doctor, saunter along the sidewalk. And then he called, "What makes you think I've got stuff on my mind?" The doctor stopped. Then he pivoted on his heels. His face was grim, but not unsympathetic. Quietly, he said, "Oh, I've seen so much fear in my life, Chris. So many people with so many secrets that they can't or won't or daren't share. And you know what the funny thing is? Most of the time, those people don't even know why they're keeping their secrets. Maybe they think they won't be believed, or even that people will laugh at them." He shrugged. "I don't know. What do you think?" Chris was silent for a moment. Then he blurted, "I saw something." "Oh, yeah?" said the doctor casually. "Last night, I woke up and I looked out of my window and I promise that whatever you tell me, I'll believe you," the doctor murmured. And Chris saw in his dark, unblinking eyes that the doctor was speaking the truth. So he told his story about the strange light and the tree that wasn't a tree, and about how the man who couldn't possibly have been a man, no matter how much Chris had tried to convince himself otherwise, had been swallowed by the earth. The doctor's eyes got starier and darker during the telling, and the more Chris talked, the more the doctor looked as if he was trying to remember something important. "Tell me what this tall man looked like," he said, after Chris had described how the figure had sunk into the ground. "He was the thinnest guy I've ever seen," Chris said, "and he had these great big hands with fingers that were, I don't know, maybe 1.5 feet long, and a huge head like... It suddenly dawned on him what the thing's head had reminded him of. Like a Halloween pumpkin. The doctor raised his eyebrows as realization dawned. "Herr Voken," he said, and he said it in such a way that it made Chris shudder. Chris licked his lips. He could barely get his voice above a whispery rasp. "Pardon me?" "Herr Voken," the doctor repeated. Then he half spun round and slapped himself theatrically on the forehead. "Oh, I should have realised. Why didn't I realise? What a prawn!" Bewildered, Chris said, "Hey, don't beat yourself up about it, man. So what are these—" "Herr Voken," the doctor said for the 3rd time. "They're—" He looked as if he was about to launch into a whirlwind explanation, then suddenly checked himself, as if he had belatedly realised the full extent of Chris's confusion and fear, and had decided that maybe the boy wouldn't be able to handle it. Abruptly he grinned, and gave Chris a friendly slap on the upper arm. "Never you mind, fella. You just keep your head down and leave it to me. I'll sort it." "Will you?" Chris said, clearly out of his depth. "Oh, yeah," said the doctor with a confident wink. Do this sort of thing all the time, me?" Martha was not a happy bunny. After getting back to the hotel the night before, she had generously offered Etta her bed, half hoping the doctor would offer her his in return. It was not that she expected him to declare his undying love for her or anything, but a little old-fashioned chivalry at the end of a long day would not have gone amiss. Instead, he had said good night, seemingly oblivious to her situation, leaving her to make the best of a small sofa on which she could only lie down if she brought her knees up to her chest. Even then, she was so tired that might have been bearable, were it not for the fact that Etta's snoring had kept her awake all night. If she hadn't heard it herself, Martha would never have believed it possible that someone could snore even louder than her brother Leo after a few drinks. The noise Etta made was like the braying of a distressed donkey, and what was worse was that it never stopped. It went on and on and on. In the end, Martha shut herself into the bathroom and tried to doze in the bath with a big fluffy towel half wrapped round her head. When even that didn't work, she got up, grabbed herself a long hot shower, and went off in search of the doctor and coffee. But the doctor's room was locked, and he didn't answer her knocks. And when Martha asked Eloise Walsh about him, she was told that he had headed out, fresh as a daisy, at first light. "That's if you can even call this daylight," Eloise said mournfully, staring at the thick veil of green mist pressing against the glass-panelled doors of the hotel. "I've never seen anything like it, and I've lived in the falls all my life. Gives me the creeps, I don't mind telling you. Hope it passes in time for the carnival." Martha shrugged. "Won't it just add to the atmosphere?" Said Eloise doubtfully. "It's a tad too much atmosphere, if you ask me. After what happened to poor Earl last night, I'm thinking of staying right here this evening, and I haven't missed a Halloween carnival since I was a little girl." "How is Mr. Clayton today?" Martha asked. "That's Dr. Clayton," corrected Eloise. "Sorry, Dr. Clayton. He's as comfortable as they can make him, from what I hear. Having to feed him with tubes, though. Poor fellow must be scared out of his wits." "Yes," said Martha. "He must be." "So you and this doctor of yours didn't find anything last night?" Eloise asked. "Not much," said Martha evasively, "but we're working on it." Eloise gave her a shrewd look and pointed at the ceiling. "So, who's your friend?" "Ah." Martha and the doctor had sneaked Etta into the hotel to avoid convoluted explanations. "So you know about that, then?" Eloise smiled thinly. "I may be old, Miss Jones, but I'm not deaf." Martha looked suitably abashed. "Yeah, the snoring is a bit of a giveaway, isn't it?" Eloise said nothing, merely raised an eyebrow. She was evidently waiting for an explanation. Martha sighed. "It's Etta Helligan." Now Eloise raised both eyebrows. "Etta? Well, in that case, would you care to tell me why you brought her back here? You and that doctor friend of yours kidnapping our old people?" Martha couldn't tell whether Eloise was joking or not. "We met her when we were out last night," she said. "We walked her home, but then we heard someone outside her house, a prowler or something. We didn't like the thought of leaving her on her own, so we brought her back here." Fearing that Eloise would start picking holes in her rather feeble explanation, she asked quickly, "Have you any idea which way the doctor went?" Eloise shrugged. "Can't say that I have. Guess he just went for a walk to clear his head. Be back soon, I dare say." "Yes, I expect so," said Martha. "Well, see you." "You going for a walk too?" Martha laughed lightly. "I need a bit of fresh air. Well," she glanced dubiously at the green mist beyond the doors. "Air, anyway. After last night I feel a bit, you know." She pointed meaningfully up at the ceiling. "I hear you," said Eloise. "You want me to give Etta a message if she shows her face? Just tell her I'll be back soon." Martha exited the hotel at something of a loss. It would be pointless wandering around town looking for the doctor, but she certainly couldn't face sitting in her room going stir-crazy, waiting for him to show up. She looked around, and through the murk hanging over the central square, she noticed a flashing neon sign. The words were blurry, but she could just make them out. Leo's Diner. Leo. Same name as her brother. That had to be an omen. And if spotting the sign had prompted it, her stomach rumbled, and she realised she hadn't eaten anything since the chocolate fudge sundae she'd scoffed in Harry Ho's yesterday afternoon. Right, she decided. Breakfast. After the torture of last night's snorefest, she deserved the full works. Bacon, sausage, eggs, beans, hash browns, toast, marmalade, and lots of caffeine. She walked across the street and into the diner. It was warm and smelled of frying bacon and coffee. The mist outside and the condensation on the windows gave her the impression the building was wrapped in green cotton wool. There was music playing in the background, bland American rock by the sort of group who named themselves after where they came from. Boston, Chicago, something like that. The place wasn't very full, possibly because it was early, or because the mist was making people reluctant to leave their homes. Like every other place in Blackwood Falls, the inside of the diner was decorated with the trappings of Halloween: paper ghosts, cardboard witches, glow-in-the-dark skeletons. Above the counter, a row of spiky furred cats made of black crepe paper reminded Martha of Etta's murderous moggies. She wondered whether the doctor had gone back to the old lady's house, and decided that if he didn't turn up within the next hour, then that was where she would head for. It wasn't much of a plan, but having one at all made her feel a little better. "Table for one," called the grizzled, sweating man cooking food behind the counter. "Please," said Martha. "Sit anywhere you like, sweetheart. We ain't exactly busting at the seams this morning." Martha plonked herself in a booth by the window, where she could look out into the street. Not that she could see much. The slowly swirling mist was like a reminder of how tired she was, how sluggishly her thoughts were moving about in her head. A grinning girl with bright blue eyes and ash-blonde hair appeared at her table and cried chirpily, "Hi, I'm your waitress this morning, and my name's Cindy." "Yeah," muttered Martha under her breath. It just had to be. If Cindy heard Martha's comment, she didn't let on. Eager as a cartoon chipmunk, she asked, "What can I get for you this morning?" Martha gave her order, and Cindy went away. Thinking of Leo reminded Martha that she was back on present-day Earth, which meant that she could try giving Tish a ring. She took her mobile out of her pocket and scrolled through her address book until she found her sister's number. She was about to press the call button when it suddenly occurred to her that for Tish, this wouldn't actually be the present day. Martha had got so used to rattling back and forth through the centuries with the doctor that a few months, or even a year or two, before or after that spring day she had originally stepped aboard the TARDIS seemed neither here nor there to her. But calling Tish might change all that, might prove totally disastrous in fact. What if, for instance, this was a few months into Martha's future, and she was ashamed to say she was only assuming this was 2008, she hadn't actually checked, and she called home only to find that something terrible had happened? Or what if, when she rang Tish, her future, or past self, was actually there, with her sister in the room, and Tish was so freaked out by the experience that it led to what? The doctor had once told Martha how the same person from different timelines should never come into contact with themselves, because it would unravel the web of time, or something. She had never really thought about that until now, but all at once she realised how tricky and complicated and dangerous the consequences of time travel could be. Not because of the monsters you might meet along the way, but because of what you yourself, with an act of thoughtlessness, might unwittingly set in motion. With a shudder, she switched her phone off and put it back in her pocket. Then, as she waited for her food, she thought about how the doctor must have had time to think about this stuff all the time for hundreds of years, and of how brilliant and special and lonely he was. And thinking about that gave Martha a renewed tingle, not simply of excitement, but of sheer, unadulterated joy. It gave her a sense, not for the first time, of how incredibly privileged she was to be travelling with him, of how, in fact, regardless of the sleepless nights and the frequent terror and the almost incessant bumps and bruises, she was the luckiest girl alive. Deep beneath the earth, the Hervoken were communicating. Theirs was an ancient language, subtle, instinctive, and complex. They conveyed meaning not through conventional speech, but via thoughts, feelings, symbols, incantations. To a human being, they might have appeared to be praying, or casting spells, or twitching involuntarily, or, at times, simply waiting, perhaps even sleeping as they drifted like phantoms on the air. But in truth, they were doing none of these things. They were conveying information, formulating a plan. They knew, through a mysterious fact-gathering process of their own, that humans might, only partly correctly, have labelled mind-reading or remote perception, or even witchcraft. That the man with the blue energy was a danger to them, and that he had an emotional link to the girl who accompanied him. And they knew, too, that the girl was currently alone. And vulnerable. Martha was halfway through her mega fry-up when the hairs started prickling on the backs of her arms. She looked out at the street. Was the mist suddenly thicker and darker? She had been able to see the cars parked by the curb pretty clearly before, but now they were hazy blocks of dimness. And the vague outline of the buildings across the square had disappeared completely, to be replaced by an almost solid bank of mist that was deepening to the murky green of overripe olives. All at once her breakfast didn't seem so appetizing, because now, as well as the hairs on her arms, Martha felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickling too. Plus her stomach was starting to churn with nerves. She tried to tell herself there was nothing to be afraid of, nothing concrete, nothing she couldn't rise above. Like the doctor had said, it was just alien chemicals or psychic flips or whatever it was they put in the mist that were making her feel this way. Determined to return to her breakfast, even though her appetite had almost completely gone by now, Martha suddenly realised the music that had been playing in the diner had stopped. Tearing her gaze away from the scene outside the window, she turned her head and gasped. The room was full of mist. It was suffusing the place with an eerie gloom, obscuring the counter, the surrounding tables, the Halloween decorations, Martha's fellow diners. She jumped to her feet, her heart thumping hard. It was difficult to tell where the mist was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. It seemed simply to be there, filling the room, and it seemed to be deepening even as she looked, turning solid objects into murky blobs, transforming day into night. Martha felt suddenly alone in the dank silence. Alone, isolated, removed from reality. "Hello?" she called. "Anyone around?" She was alarmed at how flat and muffled her voice sounded, how the marshy mist seemed to swallow it. Suddenly sensing a presence behind her, feeling cold breath on the nape of her neck, she spun round. There was no one there. "Hello?" she called again, annoyed at the rising panic in her own voice. "Will someone please answer me?" Once again, the mist stifled and seemed to gulp down her words. And once again, there was no reply. Right, Martha thought. Right. What would the doctor do? What would he do if he didn't have his sonic screwdriver? He'd make for the door, that's what. He'd try to find out what was going on. She slid out of the booth and started walking in what she thought was the direction of the door. The mist was so thick now, it was like being blind. She could feel it on her skin, like the cobweb caress of ghostly fingers. It was hard not to get disorientated. Even though she knew the door couldn't be far away, she couldn't help but think she was heading out into a wilderness, a limbo, a nothing place. A place where she might get lost and wander forever. Despite the cold, she was sweating, and her heart was still bashing away in her chest. "Calm down," she told herself. "Don't panic. You're in the diner, that's all. Anything else is just your imagination." "I know what you're doing," she said. trying to sound as if she wasn't affected in the slightest. "I know what you're doing, and it won't work on me. I've seen stuff you wouldn't believe. If you think a bit of mist is going to scare me, then you're very much A figure loomed out of the murk. Martha had to use all her willpower to stop herself crying out. Mist drifted over the figure and then spun away, making her think of a present being unwrapped. She leaned forward and saw that it was Cindy. The waitress was standing still as a statue, her eyes wide and glassy, her mouth half open. She didn't react when Martha touched her shoulder. She didn't even appear to be breathing. "Cindy," Martha said, "can you hear me?" The girl didn't respond, just continued to stare vacantly into space, like a standing corpse. Martha shuddered and moved on. A couple who had been having breakfast in a booth nearer to the door were similarly affected. The woman was holding a fork with a piece of waffle jammed onto the end of it. Her husband had his right hand curled around a mug of cooling coffee. Both were gazing into space as if they were catatonic with shock. Was everyone in the diner like this, she wondered? Hypnotized or paralyzed or whatever? Was everyone in town like this? But why not her? And what about the doctor? As if in answer to her question, Martha suddenly realized that she could see someone moving about in the gloom ahead. "Doctor," she called, "is that you?" If it was, he was not only moving slowly, but also remaining silent. Perhaps he can't hear me, she thought. Perhaps the mist is so thick that he literally can't hear my voice. "Doctor!" she shouted again, and the figure drifted closer. Yes, she thought, it is him. Or someone tall and thin at any rate. But as the figure came closer still, Martha felt a crawling sense of unease. This wasn't the doctor. This was a giant, like someone on stilts. And this person wasn't just thin, but emaciated, skinny as a rake. And there was something wrong with the person's head. It was too big, too wide, like... Then the figure stepped forward out of the gloom, and Martha saw it clearly for the first time. "Oh my!" she breathed, and backed away. The creature fixed her with its black, beady eyes. It opened its vast, zigzag mouth in its great squashy head, and she saw rows and rows of serrated, shark-like teeth. She backed into a table which scraped a few inches across the floor. Cutlery rattled, a ketchup bottle fell over with a thump. The creature raised a hand which was almost as long as Martha's entire arm. Its taloned fingers moved slowly, clicking like bones as they did so. It made a sound, a breathy, high-pitched sound, something between a sigh, a murmur, and a giggle. Then it extended a long, spiny finger and seemed to draw something in the air in front of Martha's face. And suddenly she couldn't move. Every muscle in her body seemed frozen. It was like being tightly bound with strong, invisible rope. Martha could only stand there, horrified, as the grinning thing reached out for her.